The Battle of Mirbat, when 9 SAS soldiers held off 400 communist guerrillas. Mirbat, Oman, July 19, 1972. Chapter 1. The Secret War. The British government denied they were there. Officially, there were no SAS soldiers in Oman. Officially, Britain had no involvement in the Dhofar rebellion. Officially, the small teams of elite operators scattered across the Arabian Peninsula were simply British Army training teams, advisors helping the Sultan's armed forces with administrative matters. Nobody believed it, but nobody could prove otherwise. The war in Dhofar had been raging since 1965, when communist guerrillas backed by the Soviet Union and China began their campaign to overthrow the Sultan of Oman. The rebels called themselves the Popular Front for the liberation of the occupied Arabian Gulf. The British called them Adu, Arabic for enemy. The stakes were staggering. Oman sat at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which much of the world's oil supply flowed. If the communists took Oman, they would control access to the Persian Gulf. They would have a dagger pointed at Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. They would have leverage over every Western economy dependent on Middle Eastern oil. The Cold War had many fronts. This one, fought in the mountains and deserts of southern Arabia, was among the most critical and the most secret. The SAS had been operating in Oman since 1970, when a palace coup replaced the aging Sultan Saeed bin Taimur with his reformist son, Qaboos. The new sultan understood that defeating the communist insurgency required more than military force. It required winning the hearts and minds of the Dhofari people, the mountain tribesmen who had been neglected for generations by the old regime. The SAS was perfect for this mission. They had honed their counterinsurgency skills in Malaya, in Borneo, in Aden. They knew how to train local forces, gather intelligence, provide medical care to remote villages, and kill insurgents when necessary. They operated in small teams, lived among the local population, and built relationships that conventional forces never could. By the summer of 1972, the tide was beginning to turn. Operation Jaguar the previous year had pushed the Adu back from key positions. Defectors from the communist ranks were being organized into loyalist militias called Furqats. The Sultan's government was building roads, schools, and clinics in areas that had never seen such investment. The Adu leadership knew they were losing. They needed a victory, something dramatic, something that would shatter the growing confidence of the government forces and prove that the communists could still strike anywhere, anytime. They chose Mirbat. Chapter 2. The Town. Mirbat was a fishing town on the coast of Dhofar, roughly 40 miles east of the provincial capital of Salalah. It was ancient by any standard, a collection of whitewashed buildings clustered around a small harbor, dominated by an old fort that had stood for centuries. The population numbered perhaps a few thousand, mostly fishermen and traders who had lived the same way for generations. The town had strategic value far beyond its size. It sat at the eastern end of the Dhofar coastal plain, controlling access to the mountains beyond. If the Adu could take Mirbat, they would demonstrate that nowhere in Dhofar was safe. They would humiliate the Sultan's government and its British allies. They would prove that the momentum of the war could still be reversed. The defenses around Mirbat were modest at best. The old Wali's fort, a traditional Arab fortification with thick walls and corner towers, housed a small garrison of about 30 Dhofar gendarmerie. These were local paramilitary police, loyal to the Sultan but lightly armed and minimally trained compared to regular army units. They had bolt-action rifles left over from an earlier era and limited ammunition. Near the fort sat a smaller building known as the Gendarmerie Compound, which held additional police forces. Scattered around the town were perhaps 40 members of the Furqat, former rebel fighters who had defected to the government's side. The Furqat were brave enough, but their reliability in a sustained engagement was uncertain. They were militia, not soldiers. The total defensive force numbered roughly 80 men. Against a determined assault by hundreds of trained guerrillas, they would last perhaps an hour. Unless someone could even the odds, the British Army training team stationed at Mirbat consisted of 9 SAS soldiers from B Squadron, 22 Special Air Service Regiment. They lived in a small compound called the Bat House, located just outside the town walls. Their mission was to train the local Dhofar Gendarmerie, a paramilitary police force, and coordinate with the Furqat militias in the area. The team was commanded by Captain Mike Keeley, a young officer who had already proven himself in the regiment's demanding selection process and subsequent operations. At 23 years old, he was responsible for his men, the security of the town, and relations with the local population. His second-in-command was Sergeant Talaiasi Labalaba, a Fijian giant known throughout the regiment simply as Laba. Labalaba had joined the British Army through the Royal Irish Rangers before passing SAS selection. He was enormous, well over 6 feet tall, powerfully built, with hands that could crush a man's skull. He had served in Borneo and Aden, where he and a fellow Fijian had confronted and killed 2 terrorist gunmen in close combat. Within the SAS, Labalaba was legendary. His comrades described him as the original Rambo, a man who seemed immune to fear, who thrived in situations that would break ordinary soldiers. When he was fully tooled up with weapons and ammunition, he looked like something out of a war movie. One soldier remembered watching Labalaba carry equipment that would have buckled lesser men, moving through jungle terrain as if the weight was nothing. But Labalaba was more than muscle. He was intelligent, professional, and deeply respected by everyone who served with him. He had a gift for connecting with local populations, a skill that made him invaluable in the hearts and minds operations that defined the Dhofar campaign. He spoke some Arabic, understood tribal politics, and could share a meal with village elders as easily as he could kill enemy fighters in close combat. The other members of the team included Trooper Sekanaya Takavvesi, another Fijian, known as Tak or Sek, who had served alongside Labalaba in Aden. The 2 Fijians were close friends, bonded by shared heritage and shared combat experiences. Takavvesi was quieter than Labalaba, but no less formidable. He had the same build, the same fearlessness, the same absolute commitment to his comrades. There was Trooper Tommy Tobin, the team medic, a skilled operator who could treat battlefield wounds under fire with steady hands. Corporal Roger Cole manned one of the heavy machine guns and would later write a book about his experiences in Dhofar. Corporal Bob Bennett provided additional firepower and would distinguish himself in the coming battle. The remaining men, Corporal Pete Warren, Lance Corporal Harris, and others filled out the small force with the specialized skills that made SAS teams so effective. 9 men. That was all that stood between Mirbat and the communist forces gathering in the mountains. Chapter 3. The Plan. The Adu had been planning the attack for months. Intelligence gathered after the battle revealed the scope of their ambition. This was not a raid or a probe. This was a deliberate assault designed to overwhelm the defenders, capture the town, and execute anyone associated with the Sultan's government. The attack force numbered at least 250 fighters. Some accounts suggest as many as 400. They were the elite of the communist insurgency, hardened veterans equipped with the latest Soviet and Chinese weapons. They carried AK-47 assault rifles, RPG-7 rocket launchers, heavy machine guns mounted on tripods, 60mm and 82mm mortars, and 75mm recoilless rifles capable of destroying fortifications. Many of these fighters had trained in the Soviet Union, China, or South Yemen. They understood fire and movement. They knew how to coordinate infantry assaults with supporting weapons. They were not peasant rebels armed with hunting rifles. They were a disciplined fighting force with professional capabilities. Their plan was methodical. They would approach under cover of the summer monsoon, the Kharif, that blanketed the Dhofar coast in mist and low clouds every year from June to September. The weather would ground any aircraft that might come to the defenders' aid. It would conceal their movements until they were on top of their objectives. The British training team relied heavily on air support for any significant engagement. Take away the jets, and 9 men were just 9 men. The assault would begin before dawn, when the defenders were at their most vulnerable. Multiple attack waves would hit the town from different directions, overwhelming the small garrison through sheer numbers. By the time the sun rose over Mirbat, the communist flag would be flying from the old fort. The Adu knew about the SAS team. They knew the British soldiers were the most dangerous element of the defense. The BATT house would be a priority target, neutralize the SAS, and the rest would fall. What they did not fully appreciate was what 9 SAS soldiers could do when cornered. Chapter 4. The night before. The evening of July 18th was quiet. The 9 SAS men went about their routine, checking equipment, reviewing defensive plans, maintaining the easy camaraderie that defined life in small teams operating far from home. The monsoon mist hung over the town, reducing visibility to a few hundred meters. The air was thick and damp, a welcome relief from the brutal heat that would return when the Kharif ended. Outside the Bat House, the town slept. A small picket of Dhofar gendarmerie manned an observation post on Jebel Ali, a low hill about 1,000 meters north of the town. Their job was to provide early warning of any enemy approach. Beyond them, in the darkness of the mountains, the Adu were already moving. The communist fighters had left their base camps in the late afternoon, moving in small groups to avoid detection. They carried everything they needed for the assault: ammunition, grenades, medical supplies, even ladders for scaling the town walls. Their commanders had briefed them thoroughly. Every man knew his objective, his route, his role in the attack. By midnight, the assault force had assembled in a wadi, a dry riverbed north of Mirbat. Final orders were given, weapons were checked, prayers were offered. At approximately 0500 hours, the first Adu fighters began their approach toward the gendarmerie picket on Jebel Ali. They moved in silence, their equipment muffled, their footsteps careful on the rocky ground. A select group of fighters carried knives rather than rifles. Their job was to eliminate the picket without alerting the town below. The gendarmerie soldiers never had a chance. The Adu hit them fast and quiet, blades flashing in the darkness. Most of the picket died without making a sound, but one soldier with faster reflexes or better luck than his comrades managed to fire a single shot before his throat was cut. That shot echoed down the hillside toward Mirbat. The battle had begun. Chapter 5. Contact. In the Bat House, Captain Mike Keeley heard the distant gunfire and knew immediately what it meant. He ordered his men to stand to the military term for assuming defensive positions and preparing for action. Within seconds, the 9 SAS soldiers were at their assigned posts, weapons loaded, eyes scanning the darkness for targets. The Bat House was not a fortress. It was a modest building with sandbag emplacements on the roof, designed more for observation than defense. The team had 2 general-purpose machine guns, a heavy Browning .50 caliber, an 81mm mortar, and their personal weapons: L1, A1 self-loading rifles and pistols. 500 meters away, next to the old Wally's fort, sat the team's heaviest weapon, a Second World War-era 25-pounder artillery piece. The gun was ancient, a relic of a previous era of warfare, but it was still devastatingly effective against massed infantry. An Omani gunner named Walid Khamis was assigned to the weapon, but the SAS had trained on it as well. As the sky began to lighten, Keeley observed movement on the slopes of Jebel Ali. At first, he thought it might be the gendarmerie picket returning from their night shift. The figures were indistinct in the mist, their outlines blurred by the monsoon haze. Then he saw how many there were. Waves of men were advancing toward the town, not dozens, but hundreds. They moved with discipline, spreading out across the slopes, using the terrain for cover. The morning light glinted off metal rifle barrels, ammunition belts, the distinctive shape of RPG launchers. The crackle of gunfire intensified as the Adu assault waves made contact with the gendarmerie positions. This was not a raid. This was not a probe. This was a full-scale infantry assault designed to overwhelm the town's defenses through sheer mass. "Fucking hundreds of them," someone said over the radio. The words became legend. Keeley immediately called for air support on the radio, knowing even as he spoke that the weather might make it impossible. The clouds hung low over the battlefield, the mist drifting in patches across the slopes. Visibility was perhaps 300 meters at best. Any pilot who tried to fly in these conditions would be flying blind, unable to distinguish friend from foe on the ground below. The request went out anyway. Hope was all they had. Meanwhile, the Adu mortars found their range. Rounds began falling on the Bat House with increasing accuracy, sending shrapnel singing through the air. The team's own mortar crew, working from a pit near the house, began returning fire, dropping shells onto positions they could barely see. The machine gunners on the roof opened up, their tracers slicing through the mist toward the advancing enemy. Chapter 6. Laba runs. Sergeant Talaiasi Labalaba made a decision that would define the battle. The 25-pounder artillery piece was the only weapon capable of stopping a massed infantry assault. Its high explosive shells could devastate entire formations, breaking up attack waves before they reached the perimeter. But the gun was 500 meters from the Bat House, 500 meters of open ground that was about to become a killing field. Labalaba didn't hesitate. He told Keeley he was going for the gun, grabbed his rifle, and ran. The AllOdds had already begun their assault. Mortar rounds were falling on the town. Machine gun fire raked the bat house from multiple directions. RPG rockets streaked through the mist, exploding against walls and sandbags. The noise was overwhelming, the continuous crack of rifle fire, the deeper thump of heavy weapons, the screams of men in combat. Through all of it, Labalaba sprinted across open ground. He was a big man, an obvious target, running through a hurricane of bullets toward a gun pit that the enemy was already trying to destroy. Any rational calculation would have concluded that he was going to die in the attempt. He made it. Labalaba slid into the gun pit and found Walid Khamis, the Omani gunner, already wounded. Without hesitation, the Fijian sergeant took over the 25-pounder, a weapon that normally required a crew of 4 to 6 men to operate effectively. He began firing alone. Chapter 7. One man, one gun. The 25-pounder is not designed to be operated by a single soldier. Loading the weapon requires one man to open the breech, another to ram the shell home, a third to set the fuse, a fourth to aim, and ideally a fifth and sixth to manage ammunition and provide security. The gun weighs nearly 2 tons. Its shells weigh 25 pounds each. The recoil is punishing. None of that mattered to Labalaba. Working with furious efficiency, he loaded, aimed, and fired the weapon by himself. The process was exhausting, heaving the heavy shells, ramming them into the breech, adjusting the elevation, pulling the firing lanyard, absorbing the brutal recoil, and then doing it all again, and again, and again. He was averaging 1 round per minute, an incredible rate for a single operator. Military manuals said it couldn't be done. Labalaba did it anyway, powered by adrenaline, training, and an absolute refusal to let his comrades down. Each shell screamed across the short distance to the advancing AllOdds and detonated among their ranks, sending shrapnel tearing through flesh and bone. The 25-pounder was designed as a field artillery piece, meant to engage targets at distances of several thousand meters. Labalaba was firing it at ranges of a few hundred meters, essentially using it as a massive direct-fire weapon against infantry in the open. The effect was devastating. The AllOdds had expected to overwhelm the town's defenses with sheer numbers. They had not expected to run into artillery fire at point-blank range. Attack waves that should have swept through the perimeter instead dissolved into chaos as shells exploded in their midst. But there were so many of them. For every AllOdds who fell, 2 more took his place. The assault waves kept coming from the north, from the northeast, from multiple directions at once. The gun pit was taking fire from all sides. Bullets sparked off the metal shield of the 25-pounder. Mortar rounds exploded nearby, showering Labalaba with dirt and debris. He kept firing. Back at the bat house, the rest of the team fought with equal fury. The machine guns on the roof poured fire into the advancing enemy. The mortar team dropped rounds on positions they could barely see through the mist. Keeley moved between positions, directing fire, encouraging his men, trying to manage a battle that was rapidly spinning out of control. Then a bullet hit Labalaba in the chin. The round tore through his jaw, shattering bone and spraying blood across the gun pit. The pain must have been indescribable. Any other man would have collapsed, would have screamed for a medic, would have focused on nothing but his own survival. Labalaba reached up, felt the wound, and went back to firing the gun. Chapter 8. Tack runs. When Captain Keeley received the radio message that Labalaba had been hit, he knew the situation at the gun pit was desperate. The Fijian sergeant was still firing, that much was clear from the steady boom of the 25-pounder, but he was badly wounded and alone. If Labalaba went down, the gun would fall silent. If the gun fell silent, the AllOdds would overwhelm the position. If the gun pit fell, the bat house would be next. Keeley asked for a volunteer to run to Labalaba's aid. Trooper Sergeant Takavvesi Labalaba's fellow Fijian, his friend, his comrade from a dozen operations, stepped forward without hesitation. The distance from the bat house to the gun pit was 800 meters. The ground between them was completely exposed, swept by fire from multiple directions. The AllOdds had machine guns, rifles, RPGs. They were specifically targeting anyone who tried to move between the British positions. Takavvesi ran anyway. The men on the bat house roof poured covering fire toward the enemy, trying to suppress the guns that were tracking Takavvesi across the open ground. It wasn't enough. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet. Tracers streaked past his head. The air was alive with the crack and whine of near misses. He made it to the gun pit and found carnage. Labalaba was still firing, his face a mask of blood from the wound to his chin. Walid Khamis, the Omani gunner, was down with a stomach wound, writhing in agony. Spent shell casings littered the ground. The sandbags were shredded by incoming fire. Takavvesi grabbed a rifle and began engaging the enemy alongside his friend. The two Fijians, both massive men, both utterly fearless, worked the 25-pounder together, loading and firing as fast as they could while returning rifle fire at the Adu, who were now dangerously close to the position. At one point, the enemy was so near that the two men fired the artillery piece at point-blank range, aiming down the barrel at targets just meters away. The shells were designed to be fired at distant formations, not at men close enough to touch. The effect was apocalyptic, but even that wasn't enough to stop them all. Chapter 9. The Gun Pit. The situation in the gun pit deteriorated by the minute. Takavvesi, attempting to rally the Omani soldiers in the nearby fort, managed to bring Walid Khamis back into the fight despite his stomach wound. The Omani gunner, displaying courage that would later earn him his country's highest gallantry award, continued to assist with the 25-pounder even as his lifeblood leaked onto the ground. Then Takavvesi was hit. A bullet struck him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Another grazed the back of his head, leaving a bloody furrow across his scalp. He stayed on his feet, kept firing, refused to stop. Another round hit him in the stomach, narrowly missing his spine. Any one of these wounds would have incapacitated an ordinary man. Takavvesi, propped against sandbags, his uniform soaked with blood from multiple injuries, continued to engage the enemy with his rifle. He would later say that he couldn't afford to stop. If he stopped, Labalaba would be alone, and if Labalaba was alone, they would all die. The Adu were now close enough to throw grenades. Several landed in the gun pit. By some miracle, only one detonated, and it exploded behind the emplacement without injuring anyone. Back at the Bat House, Keeley made another decision. He and Trooper Tommy Tobin, the team medic, would make their own run to the gun pit. The men there needed medical attention, and they needed reinforcement if they were going to hold. Keeley and Tobin sprinted across the same ground that Takavvesi had crossed, through the same storm of fire, with the same odds of survival. Both men made it, diving into the gun pit amidst the chaos of the ongoing battle. What Keeley found was a scene from hell. Labalaba was still somehow functioning, still trying to serve the gun, despite the horrific wound to his face. Takavvesi was shot to pieces but still fighting. Khamis was gut-shot and fading. The gun pit was ankle-deep in spent brass and sticky with blood. Tobin, the medic, immediately began treating the wounded. He reached across Labalaba's body to tend to Takavvesi's injuries. A bullet struck him in the face. Tobin went down, mortally wounded. He would die later from his injuries, never regaining consciousness. Seconds later, Labalaba, the giant who had held the gun pit alone, who had absorbed wounds that would have killed lesser men, who had single-handedly bought time for the entire defense, crawled toward a 60mm mortar nearby. Perhaps he intended to add its firepower to the fight. Perhaps he simply refused to stop moving, stop fighting, stop resisting. A bullet struck him in the neck. Sergeant Talaiasi Labalaba, British Army, 22 Special Air Service Regiment, died in the gun pit he had defended for over 2 hours against impossible odds. He was 30 years old. Chapter 10. The Jets. Captain Mike Keeley was now alone with a dying medic and a critically wounded Fijian, surrounded by hundreds of enemy fighters who could smell victory. The Adu were meters away. They had breached the perimeter wire. They were closing on the gun pit from multiple directions. Keeley fired his rifle until it was empty, then drew his pistol and kept firing. Takavvesi, unable to stand, propped himself against the sandbags and continued to engage targets with whatever strength remained in his shattered body. It should have been the end. At Al-Kwarif, the main SAS base 40 miles away, the team's earlier radio calls had triggered a frantic response. G Squadron, the unit that had just arrived in Oman to relieve B Squadron, was scrambling to mount a rescue mission. But the monsoon weather that had concealed the Adu approach was now working against the rescuers. The clouds were too low for helicopters. The mist was too thick for pilots to navigate. Then, around 10 in the morning, the clouds began to lift. Just enough. Back Strike Master light attack jets of the Sultan of Oman's Air Force appeared over Mirbat, flying at barely 150 feet to stay beneath the cloud ceiling. They had received the distress calls. They had waited for any break in the weather that would allow them to intervene. Now they struck. The strikemasters came in fast and low, their 20mm cannons hammering and their rockets streaking toward the ground. The pilots had trained for close air support missions, but nothing had prepared them for this flying beneath a ceiling of clouds at barely 150 feet, trying to identify targets in swirling mist, knowing that a single mistake could kill the very men they were trying to save. They pressed their attacks with extraordinary courage. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The guerrillas, who had been on the verge of overrunning the gun pit, suddenly found themselves under attack from above. Cannon shells tore through their ranks. Rockets exploded among their formations. Men who had advanced fearlessly against rifle and artillery fire broke and ran when the jets screamed overhead. The AllOdds had no effective anti-aircraft weapons. They had planned for a quick victory before air support could arrive. Now, caught in the open, they were being massacred. One strikemaster pilot, pushing his aircraft to the limits of its capabilities in the terrible weather, pressed his attack so close that his plane was damaged by ground fire. He nursed his crippled jet back to base. Mission accomplished. Behind the air strikes came the helicopters. G Squadron's relief force, 22 SAS soldiers who had been waiting, fully armed and equipped, for any chance to reach their comrades, lifted off from al-Qwarif the moment the weather allowed. They landed south of Mirbat and immediately engaged AllOdds elements that were still in the area. The battle that had raged for more than 5 hours was over in minutes once the reinforcements arrived. The AllOdds, caught between the jets above and the fresh SAS troops on the ground, fled into the mountains. They left behind at least 30 bodies. Some accounts suggest the true casualty figure was closer to 80 or even higher, with many wounded dragged away during the retreat. The gun pit fell silent. Chapter 11, The Aftermath. When the relief force reached the gun pit, they found a charnel house. Labalaba lay dead beside the 25-pounder he had served alone for so long. Tobin was dying, his face destroyed by the bullet that had struck him while treating his comrades. Takavvesi was somehow still alive, despite wounds that a military surgeon would later describe as the worst he had ever seen on a living person. When medics brought a stretcher to carry Takavvesi to the evacuation helicopter, the Fijian refused. "Fuck that," he said. "I'm walking out of here." And he did. Shot through the shoulder, grazed across the skull, gut shot with a round that had barely missed his spine, Sergeant Talaiasi stood up and walked to the helicopter under his own power. That was the kind of man who served in the SAS. The Battle of Mirbat was over. 2 SAS soldiers were dead, Labalaba killed in action, Tobin mortally wounded and dying. The AllOdds assault had been shattered. Their elite fighters scattered into the mountains with nothing to show for their carefully planned operation except bodies and defeat. 9 men had held against at least 250. 9 men had broken the back of the communist insurgency in Dhofar. 9 men had saved a town, preserved a nation's control of its territory, and kept the Soviet Union from gaining a foothold at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. And almost nobody would ever know. Chapter 12, The Secret. The British government's reaction to the Battle of Mirbat was not celebration. It was silence. The war in Oman was officially secret. British involvement was officially denied. The SAS soldiers who had fought and died at Mirbat were officially not there at all. To publicize their heroism would be to admit that Britain was fighting a covert war on the Arabian Peninsula, an admission that could have diplomatic and political consequences. So the story was buried. There were no headlines in British newspapers. There were no television interviews with the survivors. There were no ceremonies at Buckingham Palace, no grateful nation honoring its heroes, no recognition of what 9 men had accomplished against impossible odds. The awards that were eventually given out were minimal, and they came 3 years after the battle. Captain Mike Keeley received the Distinguished Service Order. Trooper Sergeant Takavvesi received the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Corporals Bob Bennett and Roger Cole received the Military Medal. These were significant honors, but they were announced quietly, without fanfare, without explanation. Sergeant Talaiasi Labalaba, the man who had run 500 meters under fire to reach the gun, who had operated a 6-man artillery piece alone, who had continued fighting after being shot in the face, who had died still trying to add another weapon to the defense, received a mention in dispatches. A mention in dispatches, the lowest form of official recognition for gallantry. A footnote, a bureaucratic acknowledgement that something had happened, without any indication of how extraordinary that something was. The men who had fought beside Labalaba were outraged. They knew what he had done. They knew that his actions had saved the gun pit, saved the town, saved all of them. They believed, and continued to believe for decades afterward, that Labalaba deserved the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award for valor in the face of the enemy. "The guy deserved a VC for what he did," said Pete Winner, an SAS soldier who fought at Mirbat and later participated in the Iranian embassy siege. "They wanted to give him a VC," said another comrade. "But because the war was secret in 1972, they said it would be headlines in every newspaper in the UK." Takavvesi, who had nearly died trying to reach his friend, was equally bitter. "I think all the people involved should have been given a medal," he said. "But medals would have meant publicity. Publicity would have meant questions. Questions would have meant admitting that Britain was fighting a secret war." So the heroes of Mirbat received footnotes instead of honors, silence instead of gratitude, obscurity instead of the recognition they deserved. Chapter 13. The Legacy. The Battle of Mirbat broke the communist insurgency in Dhofar. The Adu had gambled everything on taking the town. They had assembled their best fighters, planned for months, achieved complete surprise, and enjoyed overwhelming numerical superiority. They had come within meters of victory within minutes of overrunning the gun pit and slaughtering the SAS soldiers who had defied them for hours. And they had lost. The psychological impact was devastating. The Adu had believed they could defeat the Sultan's forces anywhere they chose to concentrate their strength. They had believed that numbers and firepower would always prevail. They had believed that the British training teams were just advisors, not fighters, not warriors, not men who would stand and die rather than surrender a single meter of ground. Mirbat proved them wrong. 9 SAS soldiers and a handful of Omani allies had held against their best assault and then shattered it. The elite of the communist insurgency had been mauled by a force outnumbered at least 25-1. The carefully planned operation had achieved nothing except casualties and humiliation. Word spread through the mountains. The government forces could not be defeated so easily. The British were not just advisors, they were the SAS, and they would fight to the death. Desertions from the communist ranks accelerated. The Furqat militias gained confidence. The Sultan's government pushed deeper into rebel-held territory. By 1975, the Dhofar rebellion was effectively over. The following year, the Sultan declared victory. The Strait of Hormuz remained in friendly hands. The oil continued to flow. The Soviet Union's plan for a foothold in the Arabian Peninsula died on the slopes outside Mirbat. None of this made the newspapers. The SAS returned to its preferred obscurity, its soldiers anonymous, its operations classified, its victories unacknowledged. The men who had fought at Mirbat went on to other missions, other wars, other challenges that would never be publicly recognized. Sekonaya Takavvesi recovered from his wounds and continued serving with the regiment. 8 years after Mirbat, he was among the SAS soldiers who stormed the Iranian embassy in London, killing 5 terrorists and rescuing 19 hostages in an operation broadcast live on television. That mission made the SAS famous around the world. But Takavvesi had already proven what he was made of, in a gun pit in Oman, alongside a friend who died firing a gun that should have required 6 men to operate. Captain Mike Keeley survived the battle but not the regiment. In February 1979, during a training exercise in the Brecon Beacons, he died of hypothermia. He was 33 years old. The 25-pounder artillery piece that Labalaba had served alone, the gun that had broken the Adu assault, the weapon that had held the line when everything else was failing, was preserved after the battle. Today it sits in the Royal Artillery Museum, known simply as the Mirbat gun. Visitors can see it there, if they know what they're looking for. Most don't. Most have never heard of the Battle of Mirbat, or Sergeant Talaiasi Labalaba, or the 9 SAS soldiers who held against 400. That's how the regiment prefers it. Chapter 14. The Lesson. The Battle of Mirbat matters because it demonstrates what the SAS truly is. Other special operations units are famous for their raids for striking hard and fast, killing their targets, and disappearing before the enemy can react. The SAS can do this as well as anyone, but Mirbat showed something different. It showed that SAS soldiers can hold. When everything goes wrong, when you're outnumbered 40-1, when your position is being overrun, when your friends are dying around you and there's no help coming, the SAS doesn't break. The SAS doesn't surrender. The SAS doesn't run. The SAS finds a way. Labalaba found a way. Shot in the face, bleeding out, surrounded by hundreds of enemies. He kept firing that gun until a bullet finally stopped him. Takavvesi found a way. Wounded 3 times, unable to stand, he propped himself against sandbags and kept engaging targets until the jets arrived. Kili found a way. Alone in a gun pit full of dead and dying men, he fought with rifle and pistol until reinforcements could reach him. This is why armies around the world send their best soldiers to train with the SAS. This is why the regiment's selection process is legendary for its brutality, because it identifies the men who will keep fighting when ordinary soldiers would quit. This is why the SAS motto is not about victory or glory, but about something simpler. Who dares wins. The men at Mirbat dared. They dared to run across open ground under fire. They dared to operate a gun designed for 6 men with a crew of 1. They dared to hold a position that should have been overrun in the first 15 minutes. And they won. 250 communist guerrillas learned that morning why the world fears the SAS. They had numbers, weapons, surprise, and a plan that should have worked. What they didn't have was any understanding of what they were attacking. They thought they were assaulting a small training team in a remote town. They were assaulting the SAS. It wasn't enough. Epilogue. Who dares wins. In 2009, soldiers from the 2nd Battalion Yorkshire Regiment traveled to Oman to honor one of their own. Captain Gavin John Hamilton, known as John, had been killed in the Falklands War, dying in a manner that eerily echoed the Battle of Mirbat. Sacrificing himself to allow his signaller to escape, fighting alone against overwhelming odds until a bullet ended his resistance. But the Yorkshire Regiment also carried a memorial for another soldier, one whose connection to their unit ran through the Royal Irish Rangers where he had once served, Sergeant Talaiasi Labalaba. The memorial was placed in the Allied Special Forces Grove, alongside honors for other SAS heroes. The original 25-pounder from Mirbat sits nearby, preserved for future generations to see, though few visitors understand its significance. Labalaba's body was returned to England after the battle. He is buried in the cemetery at St. Martin's Church in Hereford, home of the SAS. His grave is visited regularly by serving and former members of the regiment, men who understand what he did and what it cost him. In 2012, the BBC named Labalaba one of the 60 new Elizabethans, 60 people who had made significant contributions during Queen Elizabeth's reign. It was recognition, of a sort, 4 decades after the battle that should have made him famous. His comrades still campaign for the Victoria Cross, the men who fought beside him, the men who saw what he did, the men who owe their lives to his courage, believe that Sergeant Talaiasi Labalaba deserves Britain's highest honor. They have written letters, given interviews, told his story to anyone who would listen. So far, the answer has been no. The war was secret. The battle was classified. The hero was just a mention in dispatches, but the men who were there know the truth. On July 19, 1972, in a gun pit outside the town of Mirbat, a Fijian sergeant in the British SAS held back an army with a gun that needed 6 men to fire. He was shot in the face and kept fighting. He was dying on his feet and kept fighting. He fought until there was nothing left, until a bullet finally found a spot that even he couldn't ignore. He gave his life so that his comrades could live. He deserved the Victoria Cross. He got a footnote, but the SAS remembers. The regiment always remembers. And now, perhaps, so will you.